I have seen plenty of comments telling me how worried you guys are about this. So I decided to dive in and test the theory. And I'm sorry, but I hate to tell you, y'all couldn't be more wrong. Headliner Nation, anytime I bring up Johnathan Taylor in a video, I get the same comments and concerns from people. They seem to be caught up on the fact that Anthony Richardson is going to steal so much value from Johnathan Taylor this year that Taylor isn't going to be worth his current ADP. So I decided to dive into the numbers and take a look at some of the top rushing seasons from quarterbacks over the last several years and really try to figure out, do those quarterbacks hurt the value of their running backs? And I think you all are going to be super surprised by what I found out for you. So make sure you hit that like button and subscribe if you're new here, because this is the type of deep diving content that you need to win your league in 2023. All right, let's start off in 2022 because we had several performances from quarterbacks last year on the ground that were super noteworthy. For instance, Josh Allen rushed for 726 yards on 124 attempts and 7 rushing touchdowns last year. Justin Fields ran for over 1,100 yards on 159 attempts and 8 rushing touchdowns. Jalen Hurts had more rushing attempts than any other quarterback last season, running the ball 167 times for 758 yards and also scoring 13 touchdowns on the ground. Daniel Jones was also pretty sneaky last year with 703 rushing yards on 121 attempts and 7 rushing touchdowns. But now that you can see all those numbers on the screen, let's put their running backs next to them and see what their numbers looked like. Now, for the purpose of this video, if there was only one true lead back, I'm only going to show his numbers. If there was a true split between a couple of different running backs, then I'm going to show the combined numbers. And the reason for that is Johnathan Taylor is probably going to get a majority of the touches himself. So I want you guys to truly see, even with the teams that have a split backfield, where we could find Johnathan Taylor in terms of just his numbers. For the Bills last year, they had a backfield that was primarily split between Devin Singletary and James Cook. They combined for just over 1,300 rushing yards on 213 attempts with 7 touchdowns last season. The Bears backfield was a big split between David Montgomery and Khalil Herbert. They put together over 1,500 rushing yards on 330 attempts while scoring 9 touchdowns. And I just mentioned a minute ago that Jalen Hurts had more rushing attempts than any other quarterback in the NFL last year. And Miles Sanders was still able to find 259 attempts of his own. And with those, he went over 1,200 yards and 11 touchdowns. And what about Saquon Barkley? He had a huge volume season last year, almost 300 rushing attempts and ran for 1,300 yards and double-digit touchdowns. So as you can see, even with some of the best rushing numbers from quarterbacks last year, running backs were still able to get their own. Now in 2021, quarterbacks were a little hit and miss on the ground because Kyler Murray and Lamar Jackson, two of the bigger rushing upside quarterbacks, missed time. But Josh Allen was still there running on the ground, and he had 122 attempts and ran for 763 yards while scoring 6 touchdowns. And again, Devin Singletary was still there, but Zach Moss was his guy splitting time. And they combined for 1,215 yards on the ground on 284 attempts with 11 rushing touchdowns. In 2020, Lamar Jackson and Kyler Murray were the two big rushing quarterbacks that season. Lamar Jackson ran for just over 1,000 yards on 159 attempts and scored 7 touchdowns, while Kyler Murray ran for 819 yards on 133 attempts and scored 11 rushing touchdowns. Now here's where things will really start to get interesting, because some of the running back numbers I'm getting ready to show you, these guys don't compare talent-wise to Johnathan Taylor. For instance, Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins behind Lamar Jackson. They ran for over 1,500 combined yards on 278 attempts and scored 15 rushing touchdowns. Do y'all remember the name Kenyon Drake? Well, back in 2020, he had a really successful season on the ground, even though Kyler Murray was running all over the place. He ran for almost 1,000 yards on 255 attempts and also contributed 10 rushing touchdowns as well. And I didn't even factor in the almost 100 rushing attempts Chase Edmonds also had on that team. I think you all are starting to see a pattern here. But let's go back just a little bit further. What about Lamar Jackson's historic MVP season back in 2019? Because that year he ran for over 1,200 yards on the ground on 176 attempts, and he scored 7 touchdowns to go along with it as well. In that season, Mark Ingram was the primary running back, but Gus Edwards got a ton of touches as well. Those two combined for 335 rushing attempts for 1,729 yards and 12 rushing touchdowns. Now, is Anthony Richardson going to win an MVP this year? No, I'm not trying to compare an MVP overall season to Anthony Richardson. I'm trying to compare the numbers on the ground that you say Anthony Richardson is going to take from Johnathan Taylor, and Johnathan Taylor won't have available to him. Now, I can already hear one of the arguments against this right now, and that's the fact that maybe you're saying Anthony Richardson is not as good of a passer as what some of these other quarterbacks are. And while that may be true in some cases, I don't think it's necessarily true overall. Because do we think that Anthony Richardson is going to be significantly worse than what Justin Fields was last year? Don't you think he might have some of the same inconsistencies that we saw from Daniel Jones? Lamar Jackson and Kyler Murray aren't necessarily the most polished quarterbacks in the world. Do we think Anthony Richardson is significantly worse than either of those guys? And speaking of Lamar Jackson, he's made some awesome strides since his rookie year. But also keep in mind, some of the same concerns that people had about Lamar Jackson are the same concerns people have about Anthony Richardson. And Anthony Richardson does have a stronger arm. But Anthony Richardson's biggest comparison is obviously Cam Newton. So why don't we take a look at him specifically real quick? And let's take a look at his numbers from 2011, 12, and 13, his first 3 years in the league. His rookie season, he ran for 706 yards on 126 attempts, and a quarterback record 14 rushing touchdowns. In 2012, his attempts stayed basically the same. He ran for 741 yards on 127 attempts, even though his rushing touchdowns did take a step back. And then in 2013, he had 585 rushing yards on only 111 attempts and scored 6 rushing touchdowns. The primary running backs his first 3 seasons in the league were D'Angelo Williams and Jonathan Stewart, with a little bit of Mike Tolbert worked in. Those are probably some throwback names for you guys. Well, in Cam Newton's rookie season, Stewart and Williams combined for 297 rushing attempts. They picked up 1,624 yards on those attempts with 11 rushing touchdowns. In 2012, with Mike Tolbert added, the trio had 320 rushing attempts. And they had a combined 1,256 yards on the ground with 13 rushing touchdowns. And then in 2013, the trio was back at it again with 350 rushing attempts, picking up 1,384 yards and 8 rushing touchdowns. In his rookie season, Cam Newton barely completed 60% of his passes for just over 4,000 yards, and he also threw 21 touchdowns and 17 interceptions. If we're being honest with ourselves and you're truly looking at Anthony Richardson's tape, this is a guy that can do basically the same thing. And keep in mind, his coach this year is Shane Steichen, who was a big proponent of Jalen Hurts' breakout last year. We just talked about those numbers a couple of minutes ago, and Miles Sanders still had a huge season last year, with Jalen Hurts leading the league in rushing attempts for quarterbacks. And if you want to point at Anthony Richardson's numbers while he was in college, you really should take a minute to study up on maybe why those numbers weren't as good as they could have been. Richardson got hurt his senior year of high school and missed a significant portion of time. He actually came into Florida behind and not able to go 100% right away. He also went through several offensive coordinators and head coaching changes during his time there. And you also have to add in the fact that the 2020 season, which was affected by COVID, wasn't necessarily the easiest for a young quarterback to guide through and get better in. But all the running backs that we just talked about pale in comparison to Johnathan Taylor. Saquon Barkley is probably the only one on this list that you can even compare talent-wise to Johnathan Taylor. And look at all the numbers those running backs were able to put up even with the quarterback seeing a significant portion of the rushing attempts. In fact, if you take the numbers from all of these running backs combined, they would have averaged 290 rushing attempts per season with 1,374 rushing yards and 10 rushing touchdowns. Johnathan Taylor's backup is Zach Moss. As long as Taylor stays healthy, I don't see Moss poaching too many touches from him. So let's talk realistic expectations based on all of these numbers that I just gave you. Taylor, I'm going to need that chalkboard again. All right, well, we already figured out that based on the numbers that we found today from all these running backs, that they averaged 290 rushing attempts on the season. So let's just be uber conservative and let's say 250 rushing attempts for Johnathan Taylor this year. Now, over the course of his career, he's averaged 5.1 yards per touch. Other running backs, based again on the numbers that we got from today, average 4.75. Let's be, again, conservative, and let's say he averages 4.8 yards per attempt this season. That would come out to 1,200 rushing yards exactly, and we're going to give him 10 rushing touchdowns because, again, that was the average that all these other running backs have scored. Also, his rookie year, he had 11 rushing touchdowns on just 232 attempts. But those numbers right there would give him 180 fantasy points, which would make him the RB15 just based on those numbers alone. And we know Johnathan Taylor isn't doing a whole lot in the passing game, but we still need to add some of those numbers. So let's look at his average over the course of his first 3 seasons. In the passing game, he's averaged 2.4 receptions per game and 18.7 yards per game. And we're going to say 2 receiving touchdowns total next year. So those numbers right there would give you 51.7 fantasy points in half PPR leagues. Add them up total, that gives you 231.7 fantasy points, which would have made him the RB7 last season in half PPR leagues. And again, I feel like I'm being pretty conservative with those numbers right there. I think his ceiling is a bit higher. So if you look at the floor, he's still going to be in the RB1 territory. Now, maybe that's not enough to make you draft him in the first round, but if his ADP holds steady and you can get him in the second round, you are absolutely smashing the draft button. But Headliner Nation, another detailed breakdown for you on the channel today. And if you love these deep dives and you love fantasy information, you have got to buy our 2023 Fantasy Football Draft Guide. The link is in the description below. It's only $21.99. There's almost 300 videos in the draft guide that are exclusive to that and that you will not find on the YouTube channel. There's also exclusive content in the draft guide that you will not find on any platform in the industry except ours. And you know what? I want to give one away for free. So if this video hits 1,000 likes, I'm going to pick somebody that comments down below and tells me where they think Johnathan Taylor finishes this season to win a draft guide. And if you've already purchased yours, that's okay. If we pick you, we'll reimburse you for it. Headliner Nation, hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, leave a comment down below. Everybody enjoy the rest of your day. Peace out, stay safe and stay healthy, and I'll catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.